Mother, or as it was supposed to be known when it was never released in America, and for the purposes of discussing this original English edition of the text, Earthbound opens on a very stark image spinning through space. Mother Earth itself, poignant and fragile. Alongside it is an accompanying melody that serves to beckon the player into the game space. The two conjoined into a plea for connection, for understanding. People are people, no matter where on the globe they are. It is then that four heroes are introduced without names. A small-town plucky boy, a girl next door, an unassuming nerd, and a delinquent with a heart of gold. These classic American filmic archetypes converge to convey the type of tapestry that Earthbound already is, a narrative about the romantic dream portrayed in the American cinema, an attempted communication from Japan to America as the Ouroboros between the two is done since the end of the Second World War. It ends with a centering of the player in a form far more personal than the simple identifications placed upon the protagonists' self-insertion as seen in the texts ever since Dungeons & Dragons by asking the player what their favorite food is. A favorite food is something frivolous, a matter of taste in the most literal possible sense. So the tale begins as the one playing it has told it. Four actors in the American romantic dream set out into its tapestry to experience all there is to experience. But not before a mysterious prologue. We are told of the alien abduction of individuals by the name of George and Maria, George having stayed behind on the Earth, and Maria never returning from the cosmos. These two figures end up constructing the father and the mother of the work, the classic Oedipal framework that America's festering corpse is built around. George is the ultimate father, George Washington, the first president, and Maria, the Virgin Mary herself of biblical origin. Crucially, the name George also refers back to Saint George, the apocryphal dragon slayer, George having given up the divine cosmic with his Virgin Mary just as his namesake of the 11th century once deliberately struck against the draconic demigod. After this abstract, phantasmagoric tale, the narrative then grounds the player. Once more we are in a small American town, no talk of the extraterrestrial or the Abrahamic to be seen. Earthbound's mundane opening, a barren and abstract portrayal of the isolated neoliberal living space, decorated sparsely of self not only for the purpose of projection but also as conveyance of the lack of interior lives that the individualist world creates due to its fixation on self-isolation, is quickly broken by the proceedings that follow. The boy's design also evokes the comic strip Peanuts by Charles Schulz in this image, perhaps the idealized picture of Americana, a comic centering around the misadventures of a group of elementary school children. While conflict and strife and political commentary exist in Peanuts, it is ultimately a palatable mirror showing the American life, one that Earthbound here calls on for its ideal American protagonist. A lamp, one of the few pieces of furniture in the room, comes to life and tries to take the life of this protagonist. Battles in Earthbound, as they are introduced here, along with the overworld actions formatted in a text box before interaction, take after the defining original text of the Japanese role-playing game as it is understood. 1986's Dragon Warrior. Dragon Warrior, as a stark contrast to Earthbound, is a text that follows a chosen warrior on a quest through a fantastic setting to attain power, and ultimately rescue a princess from a dragon, as is the classical hero like the aforementioned Saint George. So Earthbound responds to the impressionistic dreams of Dragon Warrior with a refutation that, much like the horror of the mundane in the works of David Lynch, the mundane spaces of childhood and adolescence themselves make the frame for a phantasmagoric coming-of-age narrative, and that dragons in fantasy can be found anywhere and at any time, and so too can evil and corruption. The lamp is the image of the banal, and yet it too is piloted by something ancient and sinister that lurks beneath every square foot of the American landmass, and so it must be put to rest the evil quelled within it. Another major distinction to Dragon Warrior is that the hero of Earthbound never kills his foes, only tames them or otherwise pacifies them. It is still through the language of violence, of course, as it is the conquest of player self over the spaces of the game text, but it is still an important aesthetic distinction in the thing. The main character of Earthbound isn't a sword and sorcery fantasy murderer, instead a child in a world far larger than he can understand. A very drastically American distinction, not simply because of its absence from the original Japanese mother to the spaces of Earthbound as compared to Dragon Warrior, however, is the protagonist's ability to run constructed just from speeding up the game world. This is postmodern time compression in its most literal form, the Marxist theory of space-time being further and further condensed by transit simply explained through the means that Earthbound allows you to traverse the land. An arbitrary fast-forward awarded to the player to compress the game into nothingness. Now the world just a toy as it always was, but can no longer pretend to even argue it wasn't. Even though there is no princess to be rescued, the protagonist must save his sisters and his mother from the assault upon his home, again calling back to those traditional gender roles and misogynies, as inscribed in games as they have been inscribed by time and culture. While one room's specter is once more a lamp, another's is a doll, specifically a Cupid doll stylized after a consumer product of the early 20th century. While the Cupies were initially designed to be the focal points of a comic strip, they quickly became far more well known for their position as collectible baubles, idols to be purchased and spent. So the boy defeats the icon of capital in this moment, the commodified, nostalgic baby doll, and it is recontextualized into something softer and more personal. Progression in Earthbound is marked by individual melodies, a small narrative of song impressioned upon the player self through the weight and spirit of the land itself. The player finds beauty in all things, even the ugly and grotesque children of capital. Soon the protagonist's mother is properly encountered, and she fills the archetypal role of motherhood within the already archetypal family. She's focused on her housework to the point of forgetting the narratively significant object needed to progress the player's spiritual journey, but ultimately is very caring and supportive. One would think a mother to be important in a text titled Mother in its original incarnation, and this relationship, while terse and somewhat banal in its expression, is an important baseline from which the rest of the game can springboard itself off of. This is what the American hegemony considers to be at least the average relationship between mother and son. They love and care for one another, even in spite of their shortcomings dictated to them by patriarchal expectations for the two roles. This connection is further embellished with the personal touch of her cooking the player's favorite food, arguably the most personal element in the work. This is contrasted against the father figure, who is a much more detached and isolated individual, to the point that he doesn't even appear to speak to the player. The protagonist's father is eternally absent, forever drenched in work and the busyness of postmodern life, and so the protagonist is forced to mature into his own self young, as so many are in the postmodern world. Soon the appeal to the great-grandfather is made, as the hero must find the key to his basement in order to find his true purpose, mentored by a mystic sage not too dissimilar to the ways the hero of Dragon Warrior is mentored by the king, even if the child's great-grandfather is long dead and confined now to a diary within the basement overrun with the material truth of rats. Before one can enter this basement, however, one must get the key to it from the family's dog outside, which can speak perfect English and walk on its hind legs, a completely sapient animal. Thus is another dreamlike element of Earthbound's setting, the anthropomorphic animals that roam the land which the protagonist has epistemic access to the thoughts of because of their own childhood wonder. Understanding and accepting this nature is what allows the child to understand and accept his grandfather's words, that oneness with the earth, a oneness with history and family. It is not to say he becomes his great-grandfather, but rather that his great-grandfather's thoughts synthesize with his own to become something new in this process. The journal itself only contains a cryptic clue, a forlorn alien etched into poetry. The immediate surroundings of the main character's home are sprawling, as is the American form of architectural design. Vastly inefficient landscapes lent a sublime quality captured in films like Wim Wenders' 1984 film Paris, Texas, ensnaring and entrapping the child that Earthbound follows. It is not only the lands themselves that are hostile, however, as the high encounter rate and the severity of the enemies in the environment are unforgiving to the player as well. The world is not a safe place for adults, let alone children, and the systems of abuse that make up America have made it a cruel and uncaring landscape. The enemies that attack the player are also of particular note. They're once more wildlife that needs to be tamed, of course, but also the neighbors of the surrounding area. These adults take on the roles of the average American stranger, hippies and farmers named Wally for the country of Wales from which they hailed, the melting pot that America loves to frame itself as in its iconography expressed with a simple choice. However, their archetypes are forced to do battle with our all-American boy. Again, darkness lurking beneath the narratives that the American regime pushes upon us, just as with the lamp and the Cupid doll. These darknesses are quelled and defeated, and the player prevails with love even in the aesthetic of violence, the hippies and Wallies of the world made kind. This is best underscored by the music that plays in the background of the area, a cheerful tune titled Pollyanna, in parentheses, I believe in you. The name evoking the titular literary character in Eleanor H. Porter's 1913 novel Pollyanna, also a text revolving around an optimistic child against the American landscape, though in a more Victorian sense than a postmodernist one. Yet that belief in good and love is an important through line between both. Pollyanna tries to see the good in all things, and so the protagonist of Earthbound does as well, and the player themselves is urged to in turn. The only way to survive is through belief and love, after all, otherwise the whole world is hollow and dull, and life simply becomes survival and not living. Through these battles, the player ends up learning psychokinetic abilities as a flavorful means of invoking the magical arsenal of the hero of Dragon Warrior, the new paladin of the American wasteland, whose power comes from individual strength as opposed to faith in any truth. One's only response to a society as deeply nihilistic as the one the player has been born into. The only neighbor who has this belief from the outset is one whose house is close by, but only because she too is in suffering, her daughter having been spirited away some time before the events of Earthbound. The player, now on a quest as similar to the hero of Dragon Warrior, determined to rescue a princess and return her home. The town of Podunk, nearest where the player lives, has a few issues typical of the American experiment: corrupt neoliberal politicians who utilize the systems of abuse to their advantage, overpriced burger shops, and incredibly expensive and prohibitive medical care, barring the protagonist from accessing what is assumed to be the universal right of RPG healing to find the first brush with civilization that the player makes here. But in addition to this, there is a more surreal infestation that is yet distinctly American: a zombie outbreak. Though zombies are traditionally found in Haitian folklore, Earthbound discusses in more precise terms the specific type of zombie that films like George Romero's 1968 horror film, Night of the Living Dead, did, shuffling cadavers with an interest in post-mortem cannibalism. This is not too dissimilar to the rural town as depicted in William Faulkner's 1930 short story A Rose for Emily, a classic of American literature, the nonlinear exhumation of rural America's clinging to romantic idealism of a past that never existed. The townspeople of Podunk may fear the zombie, but they are who embraced it and allowed it access to them, nostalgia resurrecting the dead in contorted forms befitting the violent ideology that gives them life. In the classically postmodern drugstores that lie in the streets attempting to stave off death for the means of the end of history, there plays a tune that draws on a song off of the Beatles' album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, When I'm 64. This hopelessly romantic song about the melancholia and loneliness inherent to aging is a fitting scrawl to ring out in the halls of these pharmacies, the everlasting march toward death emphasized in its lyricism and composition just as the dread chthonic chime of a medicine bottle invokes Thanatos into existence. At the top of Podunk's department store, one can find a canary, the only thing that can be gotten for free, even if it is with a little haggling that the act of the freeing is performed, because it is the only inch of nature and belief that exists in the place. So there is a beacon of hope amongst the shambling hospice care buildings in the United States at the end of history. and our hero takes with him the baby canary. To the west of Podunk, as has been stated by some of the townspeople, through winding forests juxtaposed against the town in sublime wonder, is a small village populated almost entirely by these canaries. The whimsical image is only broken by a single man there who explains that it's some kind of nature preserve for the canaries, human influence having reconfigured the land so drastically that new constructions must be built for the safety of the creatures that they once shared with them. Its appearance in the text of Earthbound is brief but meaningful, seeing as it is where the canary Laura is met in all her victorious classical Latin glory, harkening back to the very laurel trees themselves. And the second melody is found within the parlance of the animals trapped in the heart of a machine they had no hand in building. South of Podunk is the cemetery, the source of the zombie outbreak. Apart from a healer living nearby on the outskirts of town due to his occult inclinations, yet still close to the cemetery and to the church in spite of his alienation, as the Christian faith itself is not too dissimilar from any cult, and the church itself, there is no life to be found here except the unliving nostalgia, Podunk's own backstory revealed through the image of itself. A rich history of crime dramas and families emerges from the catacombs here. Once more the darkness of Americana exhibits, but also an impressionistic fantasy version of that said darkness. The specter of nostalgia is presented as a mafioso crime drama, much easier to contend with the horror of resurrection and mob violence when cloaked in the hyper-violent postmodern guise of Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather. Deep in the bowels of the mausoleum, not too dissimilar from the mausoleum that is the drugstore in the city streets of a dying small town, the protagonist finds his neighbor's missing daughter, who reveals herself to be Pippi Longstocking, herself of the 1945 Swedish novel written by Astrid Lindgren. Pippi is a party member who briefly joins after her appearance is in many ways the polar opposite of the main protagonist. She's assertive and remarkably strong, just as the literary character herself is for a little girl. Aside from the comic elements of this choice, it's also a highlight of the inherent feminine that makes up the work and further impresses upon the player what they were already informed of by its initial Japanese title, Mother, that in spite of the protagonist being male, the feminine is the core pillar of the world. Even if Pippi was the proverbial princess of Dragonwire in the hero's transgressions into the crypt beneath the ground, she is more formidable than he could ever hope to be. When she is in the presence of the boy, the overworld theme becomes something else. No longer just a Pollyanna longing for belief, now the realization of that belief into catharsis. The song Bein' Friends is an affirmation of that belief growing in the presence of others. Returning her home brings the protagonist two things: entry to the zoo to the north of the town, which the mayor grants to the protagonist only after taking credit for the entire rescue to boost his electoral prospects, and also a chat with Pippi back at her home. Pippi gives the young boy a Franklin badge, an object coded in founding myth. Just as George Washington was invoked at the game's onset, Benjamin Franklin is invoked here. The Franklin badge, a new mythic artifact of the postmodern empire, a supposed relic left over from Franklin's study on electricity, in the same vein as someone purporting they found the golden fleece in Colchis. Earthbound displays the ways that the American mythos is crafted effortlessly, its fascist tendrils exposed through badges given by the children of European literature. When the boy arrives at the zoo, a small gag plays out where a monkey steals the key to the zoo before the player can open the gate, only to find that the lock to the gate was broken already, and the player can proceed. While the beautiful and exotic animals of the zoo are typically harmless creatures, some kind of industrial noise sounding throughout the space is causing them such distress that they become hostile and alien. Gorillas and tigers exemplifying the plight that the protagonist finds themselves in navigating the spaces of America. The singing monkey exhibit is empty, the whimsy and fun of the setting completely removed from it. No song so long as the noise drowns out all the world, in a fashion almost similar to the 1968 film Yellow Submarine's portrayal of music as the antidote to human sadness, fitting as the Beatles have already come up once in this discussion. At the zoo's center, past all the wild beasts of the American fantasy, even if they are of the human reality, the young boy finds a pill-shaped spacecraft containing an alien in the guise of some sort of fascistic techno-soldier. The alien other framed as the villain, making the animals violent rebels as opposed to the influence of industry. Perhaps the violence of the zoo is simply revealed through the presence of the Starman, a holdover of colonialism brought to light by its tinnitus ray. Whatever the case, the boy strikes down the Goliath alien not through means of sling, but through all-American baseball bat and the protection of the badge Benjamin Franklin himself fashioned. The fascist American lie destroys the for another, and the sound is silence. The animals return to their happy positions. Most notably of all, the singing monkey, which inscribes yet another beautiful melodic truth into the boy, as did the doll and the canary. Pepperland resurrect in his shapes as forged in lyricism, not from lion, as the Christian might say, but from primate. So the boy journeys from the town of Podunk Forest, past the policemen who try to obstruct him as he is free from their systems of abuse, to a lone pink shell sitting in a cave idly passing the time. He speaks to it in a language of telepathy, not one that you or I can understand, calling upon his great-grandfather's cryptic poem from his old torn diary, his own synthesis with his legacy allowing him access to the shell. He is gone in a moment, and emerges elsewhere. Oh, hello. Didn't think that you would see me here, would you? Thought I was gone for good. Well, isn't that rich? I've never truly gone, seeing as I've been crystallized in the digital viscera for this long. If you don't know who I am, that's all well and good. All you need to know is that you're my lovely guest, and I'm going to be narrating a children's novel to you for the duration of the evening. After all, who better to be the narrator than the true author of Ghostbusters, the greatest novel never to be finished? Not that transsexual hussy who took my place, the individual she would have been if she had never indulged in that fantasy. But my spite towards the future, that is irrelevant. This story is titled The Cow and the Dragon. You may be thinking this will take a lascivious turn. Oh, no, not at all, dear viewer. While cows and dragons have made love before this is no story of their conjugal union. Instead, it is a beautiful and true narrative. Don't we all love those? I know that Vrissy, that one who took the moniker of Everlasting Arcasian from me, thinks they cannot exist, but I am forever her opposite, even locked solely in memory. There are truths embedded throughout history that will exist for all of time, no matter what she says. In a land far flung from this one, between space and time and all manner of things in between, lived a very small cow with grand ambition. This cow was no ordinary cow of ordinary persuasion, of course. She was speckled with black and white all over as any ordinary cow might be. But she was full of a burning hunger to make herself something more than the denizen of endless rolling pastures as her peers were in prelapsarian paradise. Antiquity of Green was a well-furnished home of nutrients, so she supposed, but certainly there had to be more to satisfy her desire for life and love. So she hung up her frolicking hooves and fashioned a pair for wandering, though the bliss could be found in the grassy landscape she had called her home her whole life. It was hardly savored without any sense of danger or thrill. 1 foot forward became 4, and she was off along the dirt path that winded down the hills and into the unknowable, that untamed wilderness just beyond the threshold of narrative stagnation. She waved goodbye to all her cow friends and stumbled down, uncertain travails becoming more certain with every step, a moroseness to leaving her home. She could never return once she had left, once she had become different, once she had become more herself. On the other side of a brambling, dark wood, which was the first stop along her journey that needs no further mention, emerged from the light a small and satisfied village of homes and holes, craters holes, gaps in the earth that were wide and round. Doors were nestled in the sides of these holes, and the cow thought that perhaps maybe these lands beyond her native one were not so dangerous as she had thought, and that her journeys would only lead to more peaceful serenities. Ripe, unplucked carrots, and some carrots still growing bravely, lined the exterior of each crater, agriculture the likes of which the cow had never seen before in her own home. A fountain babbled at the town's center, roaring with dark fervor. Walking the cobblestone paths that connected the various crater homes to each other were a race of people most similar to rabbits, long-eared furry creatures who hailed from the stars, but the cow had little knowledge of such a people. They pitter-pattered with dainty character, demure as they were, and looked at the cow with anxious expression. And excitement buzzed about each and every Lapin stranger yet to befriend, but none approached out of a nervousness. Though the bunny is a perpetually intrepid creature of curiosity, its feeble frame leads it prone to a fear of its own inquisitiveness that would make even the curiously cautious cat blush. There was one rabbit who wasn't too afraid of the cow to speak, though, one who had made herself busy by walking through the cobblestones as opposed to on top of them somehow. The very act itself was unlike anything that the cow had seen before. The phasing through matter was a short phase of their interaction, however, as she surfaced above the cobblestones when she finally reached the cow and held out a limp and inviting paw. She introduced herself quickly, and the cow shook her paw with hoof through means incomprehensible. The rabbit led the cow along the paths through her tiny village, allowing her to meet those who made their ornamental ware, of which there was much for such a small space, and the place that any traveler could rest should she find her way to the tiny rabbit theater in the middle of the thicket. The ornamental ware itself was unlike anything that the cow had seen. Studded amulets and necklaces and jewelry of all kinds, with the colors of the sun and the seasons and all the things she had only come to associate with the natural sublime. She and the rabbit both acquired matching bracelets to commemorate their meeting and their newfound kinship, and the two of them played in the fountain and among the cobblestones underneath the heavy and old skies as if they were as young as the calf had been when their hooves first found footing on verdant green. The fountain itself eventually joined in the revelry all its own, its waters shaking and trembling with joy at the sight of such happiness, the stone rabbit carvings which poured water out of their jaws moving from expressions of cold neutrality, weathered into being by an unknowable period of time to gratitude and happiness. It was only on the cow's second day in the small hamlet that a third member was added to their entourage. Also staying in the town was a dark-feathered, lanky figure with a sharp mouth matching his wit, who could most often be found in the town square sitting cross-legged at the edge of one of the holes that could be found around the town. This crow was a musician, and with lyrical letters he could sing life into being, time and space at his fingertips as a master over the true witchery. His abstract shapes were given meaning and form by the cow and the bunny, who hung on his every word and interpreted them studiously. He spoke of castles, of dragons, of jesters, of nightmares, the types of things one only encounters while walking against the walls of sleep and seeing through their boundary for only a moment. Only yesterday, the cow had hardly thought a community of rabbits was a possibility, and now she was seeing images beyond the bounds of imagination themselves. There was an epistemic anxiety to the entire affair, an abstract discomfort that the cow could not place as nostalgia or terror. Each time she and the rabbit sat to listen to the serenade of the crow, it was as if the world became a bit bigger and more frightening. Certainly more so than she had known in her small rolling hills, an incidental infiltration of the basilisk to her thoughts. It was the crow who planted the inkling in the cow's brain that the dragon at the heart of the woods had not only never been bargained with successfully, but that it could be done if one were clever enough, and so the cow decided that she must be the one to do so, much to the chagrin of the rabbit close to her. The cow bid her home amongst the craters and the carrots and the charms goodbye, but held her bracelet to her wrist tight, knowing that she would see the rabbit and the crow and all the people of the village once more. The paw waved a handkerchief of silk in the air as the rabbit teared up at the prospect of the cow's departure, where the crow lay on the cobblestone in sullen expression. It was a quest the cow had to face by herself, or so she thought at the very least. What if her new friends were to be consumed by the dragon itself? Through the thicket at the other edge of the dream that was the rabbit village the cow trotted, stepping over bramble after bramble. As she did, it felt as if the trees themselves cast their ire upon her, eyes made of oak and bark and sap congealed into something more crystalline and everlastingly putrid. Sticks scratched against her sides, a black wind howled through the unmarked paths that punctured the woods. This was the truth of the matter that the rabbits in the pastures had shielded her from. She followed the rhythms of the songs she remembered still reverberating through her skull over the strong winds further still through the bottom of the night, in spite of the pain she endured from the scraping bark all around her. The bears of the wood were not ordinary bears, though she had no conception of bears in the first place to have for any point of comparison. They appeared as stuffed animals sewn together with seams and made of plush fabrics, their texture soft to the touch. They didn't move, only watched from between the trees, their eyes rolling along their skulls as some kind of macabre haunted painting might do in that old fortress Otranto. At any moment the cow feared that one of the trees may speak to her, may tell her of their folly and the endless anguish that they faced in this Gothic wood, then explained as ontologically justified by some kind of divine order in a regretful soliloquy, but the only whispers she heard were from the wind itself, broken, guiding, tired. Just when she thought she might turn around and return to the village of the rabbits to play for the rest of her days with her newfound friend, she came upon it in the middle of the woods, an oddly vibrant chateau. It had had wear and tear, far more evidence of entropy than anything the cow had ever seen before, but it was still in pastel colors in spite of the many years it had evidently endured. 2 great oak doors, one must presume of the surrounding forest, guarded with tight-lipped secrecy the interior of the space. At its top was a belfry with a single opulent and pristine golden bell, in opposition to the rest of its exterior, which reflected the warm sun hidden by the canopy of the brambles. It was a respite, a sanctuary from the thorns, or so it appeared, and so the cow clambered over the lumpy path to those impositions in front of her. Her hoof rapped the door 3 times, and what emerged was not a rabbit or a cow or even a crow, as she had come to experience in the past few days, but something far stranger. It was a pale, short little thing, with soft skin that had no fur or feather to speak of, clothed in a brown robe of some material the cow had never so much as perceived before. Through holes in this hood of this robe stuck out 2 sharp pointed ears, and its face was mostly composed of 2 large, wide eyes that stared into the distance, unfocused on anything particular, not even the cow standing in front of it. It ushered the cow into the chateau with great care as to not trip over its own garb as it trailed over the floor. The cow herself, clumsy as she was, nearly slipped a few times, and revealed what those doors had hidden from her. It was a sparse room in spite of the perceived regality of the exterior building. A festering scene even to a cow that had never seen mold before, and yet there was still a romantic beauty to the place. It was a picturesque little monastery, more robed gnomes running to and fro through its spaces and into the various rooms barred by more doors of secrecy. There was a quiet majesty as one of them dusted, and the one that had led the cow into the building itself further led the cow to one of many doors. The only light source was a candelabra, though curious to the cow was that as opposed to the light coming from the flames, just as light came as she understood it from the great flame in the sky, it instead seemed to dissipate around the fire, the small embers creating a shadowy blackness around the rims of the candles that burned darkly through the dawn. When the door opened, the light only grew, and she came face to face with a creature much unlike the gnomes, one tall and radiant with multicolored plumage. These feathers had an oddly transparent quality to them. Pure light bent through their shapes to be solid color, the most abstractly platonic imaginings of color possible. The colors didn't seem to move with the feathers, however, almost existing on another plane of existence. The rest of the peacock in front of the cow threatened to make the cow blind were there not another candelabra that ate the light of the room, doing what little part it could to stay the incomprehensible power of the feathered fowl sitting on her bed with softness. Her robe was of a different make than those of the drab gnomes, and almost appeared as if it conveyed a narrative through tapestry, shapes and figures leaving behind smaller shapes and figures in conflict, shapes and figures sharing a bed together. Her eyes were just as striking as the rest of her was, made of crimson fire, and constantly weeping something red and tragic. She stared at the cow for a good long while without a word, only an acknowledgment of the bovine's existence. And then, when it felt as if an eternity had passed lost in the fires of her eyes, a song came from her beak, which had rows of teeth quite unlike the crow, who, as most birds do, had no teeth to speak of. Also unlike the crow, the song was a very warbling and tragic one, and no shapes of beauty or intrigue came from its invocation, only cracks and edges drew across the very space between the two of them. The cow covered her ears, and yet the song was still heard with perfect clarity, impossible to be muffled by any exterior force. Yet as soon as the cracks might have reached the cow, another infinity ended, and the peacock closed her beak. A vision of small creatures in proportion similar to the gnomes of the monastic chateau forged from glass and shadow and a small spinning wheel appeared to her, and as soon as she had seen it, the peacock closed her eyes. The cow wobbled outside the small room, which she had not even gotten so much a chance to glance at in her distraction, and once more into the barren room that she had come from. She bid goodbye to the gnomes and hurried out the door. The vision burned into her retina such that whenever she closed her eyes, she saw its outline. As if controlled by some force beyond her, she walked straight to the north. Only a single gnome poked its head out the front doors of the chateau to see that she was gone. It adjusted its robe in a huff and slammed the doors behind it, yet the bell did not ring. Only a few paces north of the chateau, hidden by its massive frame, was a small gazebo with images of the cosmos imprinted upon its sides. Each one appeared as the tiny lights that the cow had seen in the sky, the motherboard of the atmosphere mapped out with accuracy, to her recollection, on the roof of the small structure. More peculiar, however, was that it spun counterclockwise, as opposed to staying still, as gazebos often do. Small, gentle steps led up into the celestial mechanism, and beneath the rotating architecture scraping out a poor partitia, the inside of the wheel roof was portrayed through the brilliant stained glass soldiers that the cow had seen in her vision only a few moments prior, lined alongside the inner rim of the spiraling shape. One by one they came down to greet her, each with their own curtsy befitting a knightly stature, and each shook her hoof a delicacy befitting their tiny fragile forms. They brought with them no singing, only words of kindness and flattery, and the spinning of the gazebo slowed as the knights all came round the cow to give their perceived dues. The cow had no idea what to do with such an army in miniature, but it was clear to her that they were, in some shape or form, a path to the dragon she had seen in shape and song, and so she clambered down the steps with the assumption that they would follow her into the brambles further. And so they did, each pitter-patter of their steps a clinking and clanking of glass against the hard wood. On the way down the stairs, one of the five tumbled over and shattered into pieces. The cow had no understanding for what had just happened. The glass creature she had just met was now a pile of its own construction strewn about the ground, completely motionless and still. The other glass soldiers came together and reconstructed it into a small post for light to refract through onto the ground, to mark the spot where it ceased with the eternal divinity of the sun, which all the forces of creation gave thanks to for existence. It was a multicolored projection, that ray of light, which gave the cow no further insight into what had happened. Where had the soldier gone when it shattered? The other soldiers would not speak further on the subject. The cow's sadness hardly acknowledged with more than a nod of their glass heads. They led her through a tunnel of trees in the brush that seemed almost as if it had simply appeared, yet still just as luring as all the other patches of wood that the cow had felt observed under, as if the teddy bears of the forest would do more than just stare. Another glass soldier shattered upon contact with a thorn, and remarkably another structure was built from its corpse that took what little sunbeams were streaming through leaves on that hill, out of the canopy and to yet another site of remembrance. The cow, once more, did not understand, even through her questioning. How could something that was once there simply cease to be there any longer? Down the tunnel of trees went, and with it down went the sunlight, though it was not yet nighttime. Soon, when nearly all the sunlight had dissipated, the trees did in turn. At first it was slow, a tree missing here or there on the side, the thicket subsiding into a clearing. As time went on, it became more and more apparent that a cave was entered, and where the sunlight vanished, the glass soldiers glowed in a humble glory, creating a small light into the depths of the formation that felt almost too perfectly dug to be organic. The cave itself felt like a tunnel into some inferno the cow had no prior knowledge of up to this day, and fear crawled up her back that she may be presented with some poor, lost, wandering soul who had found their way down into the bowels of the earth just as she had found herself there. For a long time, while there was nothing to that effect, the only company besides her odd retinue of living glass, one of which, once more, tripped over and was built into a monument that pointed a beam of light further into the dark to stay it back, being a sinking feeling that, once more, she was being watched by some higher order of beast. Unlike the woods outside the cave, however, there were no teddy bears to pay her attention throughout the spaces of the cave, and so she had nothing that she could point to as the source of this unease, only a sensation that she was being stalked by something dangerous and old and knowing. This came to a close when she met the fool. It was a scaly creature laying on its side with no limbs to speak of, only two flat things protruding from its side and a large bulbous eye not too dissimilar to those of the gnomes up in the chateau. It flopped when it spoke, and with its flopping came a rhythmic jingling of small brass bells that adorned its hat made of some material soft to the cow's hoof.
Whatever that material was, the cow could never learn, for the fish was of few words, emaciated and dying as it was, though the cow had no means of understanding such a thing. In its final thrashes and throes and struggles, it knocked down one more glass soldier with a shattering that echoed throughout the quiet cavern, and spat up the hook that caught it. The only glass soldier that was left constructed one more ziggurat to its condemned sibling, and the fish fell limp. The cow poked the fish with her hoof, but she was met with nothing. She had begun to think she had lost herself in the darkness of dreams for naught, and that the wily old crow had tricked her into suffering. The fishhook that the creature had held in its mouth was what the cow presumed allowed it to speak and move earlier, but no amount of putting it back in gave it any more life. It was a hook crafted of a fine purple stone, one that felt as if life itself has been removed from it in order to portray its cold brilliance. She turned it over in a hoof a few times before she gave it to the glass soldier. She turned to leave, even knowing that the cave went further and further down, and yet she could no longer make out the exit amongst the rock, the way back barred to her. The glass soldier stood idle and forlorn, and the two of them made their way further. A beckoning made itself apparent through the silence of the cavern as the low light of the solitary glass soldier illuminated less than the sounds of snoring. It was such an intense and low utterance that reverberated through the false halls of the cavern that the cow figured it could not be anything other than a dragon. It was a few paces after this that the descent into the cavern opened up into a grand hall carved from the rock. In comparison to the chateau, it was perhaps the most decadent thing that the cow had ever laid eyes on. A chandelier of crystal so transparent it could be mistaken for pure light at the top of the grand hall, and a table that stretched out in front of her with purple and red tapestry as its tablecloth like the hues of early morning. Gilded chairs surrounded this table, and yet in spite of all the bluster and the silverware and the most even and easily traversed floor the cow had ever had under her feet, there was no one to enjoy the spacious hall. The only presence was that of the dragon she had sought, sleeping, snoring loud enough to rock the chandelier at the mouth of the cavern. It was an iridescent hue, though which one the cow found impossible to describe. It was almost as if its color would change every time she came to settle on any particular description of its appearance. The glass soldier shook, but did not explode into shards, and the two approached the slumbering creature. Its body undulated with each individual snore, as if the rainbow itself would shake and crumble from the might of its rest. The cow reached out to wake it, but hesitated. Its breaths could break the resolve of the most powerful magician, and here was but a single bovine. As the cow turned to leave, the divine dragon beamed an image of the golden bell into her mind with but a single sigh. It was the bell atop the chateau she had noticed when she first came across it in the thicket. All she knew to do was ring it, and the dragon would wake. But how fortuitous could such a thing be? The cow left behind the drake to its dreaming dead, but found she could no longer return to the waking world. The hole in which she had descended into the grand hall from the cavern had closed behind her. Before she had any thought to panic, something peculiar occurred. A shadow danced down from the wall in the shape of one of the glass soldiers, though much larger and more prominent than them or even the gnomes. It snaked around the room like a noodle, but was eventually still, two bright gemstones for eyes and a cut coming across the thin top of the form whenever it spoke. "So," screeched the voice, a quotation so loud and clear to the cow that it was the only one that bore repeating. "You are trapped here as well." The shade danced its fingers in the shape of a smaller humanoid to the glass soldier who was up against the wall. With a flick, it too shattered into a series of shards, the brilliant hook clambering to the ground with an echo through the hull. The dragon did not wake, even with this explosion, which expelled life repeating all at once throughout the dismal space. There was no monument to the final glass soldier, because the cow had no knowledge of light that the glass soldiers themselves did, and so its pieces lay unfulfilled and unresolved. The shadow cackled as the rest of its form caught up to the fingers that had left behind its body, its gemstones unwavering in the reflection of the light. Fear traveled through the cow's body with a quickness unlike anything she had ever felt before. What was this sensation? "Soon you'll become no more than I am, bovine traveler." The shadow became long, as if it lay on the ground of the wall. Two of its legs kicked into the air, and one arm rested behind its head. "A shade resurrected by some invisible witch of Endor whenever anyone enters this depth of the labyrinth. There is no escape from this realm. Only a fool would believe such a thing were possible." The cow looked at the hook, which she found in the mouth of a jester, and held it closely with her hoof. The shadow held its stomach and laughed until it could hardly breathe, jagged shards of sound cutting into the cow's mind.
You think clinging to something like that will keep you from losing who you are like me? You'll just end up forgotten here all the same, like your fragile, dead companion who I crumbled with a single touch.
These words crawled across the cow's hide. Dead. The cow clutched the hook tighter in response, fueled by something deep and ancient and powerful within her that she could not hope to understand. Words like dead had no meaning to her, and yet they brought with them a feeling of anger and sadness. With the strength of her hoof around the hook, the world around her distorted and shifted, a purple haze coloring the once golden room. The shade on the wall stared with an evil grin.
Oh, I know the score now. That fool really did have a way out, didn't he? Well, well, well.
A shrieking series of laughs mixed with sobs filled the air as the cow grew ever further and ever distant. The last thing she heard before she vanished was a simple whimper, and then utter silence. Do you really think that I'm going to tell you the rest of the story just now, dear guest? Where does the hook take her? What of the rabbit and the crow and the peacock and the bell? In time, my patient friend, in time. For now, we must return to something far less beautiful and true for a moment, and listen once more to the one who expelled me to the non-existent aether, only to be pulled from that purgatorio when she chooses to use me to make some kind of point about something or other. I hope that you like the narrative, because I quite do. I, the shade upon the wall, ever watching, forgotten but never gone, as I am condemned to the cells of memory. Ciao.
When the player emerges from Magicant, they are in the middle of the spacious American countryside, once more presented with a land too big for their easy traversal as contrast to the romantic dreams of Dragon Warrior found in the pink clouds and swords and sorcery of Magicant. The flying saucers and eagles encountered here make for an interesting contrast. Both the symbol of American imperialism itself and the divine alien are both enemies within this space. It is soon that the player finds themselves in Marysville, a town named as part of America's supposedly happy and gregarious facade. Beneath Marysville is a sickness. Criminals wander the streets along with the implements used to try to execute them. Middle-aged women attack children just for standing in their way, and cars and trucks veer off the road in pursuit of the player character. In these battles with these automobiles, something becomes apparent about the player character that has never been made apparent before. That he has asthma, a far cry from the superhuman hero of Dragon Warrior. A helpless child in all senses of the expression. The corruption beneath Marysville goes all the way down to the underfunded Twinkle Elementary School, which in spite of its hopeful name is staffed by a janitor who despises his family and populated by children so invested in the endless machination of sequels that they create fake sequels to Super Mario Bros. No original thought to be had even in their fantastical lives. This is all best expressed by the archetypal bullied nerd atop the school's roof. Violence so embedded in American systems that the children of them learn to force their peers into trash cans from an early age, and those peers can only be coaxed out of their hiding through the transaction of weapons. Those specific weapons being bottle rockets is no coincidence, of course. The hyper-fetishization of STEM, or science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields, and thusly empiricism within American schooling being largely motivated by the rocket arms race spurred on both by World War II and the launch of Sputnik in October 1957. So the bottle rocket is the American schoolboy's dream. After all, what better flavor of destruction than the one that's going to help assert the dominance of the fascist megaculture's reality and beat the Russians? This particular screen is one of the most striking in the game. The Mount Itoi, named for the game's director Shigesato Itoi, looming in the background, and yet nothing compared to the rest of the game space. Itoi's presence important but yet muted, the player's interpretation of the abstract spaces far more significant. The player goes to a small factory to the south of the town to retrieve the bottle rockets that the nerd asks for, once more another labyrinth of violence hidden behind a saccharine name, the Little Sweet Factory. This factory is derelict, a representation of the way American industry left the country and all the jobs and dreams died with it because of capitalist outsourcing. The trash can at the end provides the player with endless amounts of these bottle rockets, endless amounts of tools for which violence can be propagated. When they return to the nerd with the rocket, he seeks to create more, and this desire is then subverted, the nerd and the player both consumed by that very violence through the explosion that the rocket's creation embroils them in. Instead of revenge, the nerd seeks friendship with the player, and the two become one. Fellow children searching for meaning in the postmodern American landscape that has all but left them behind, for they have no use to the hegemony quite yet. The nerd is archetypically frail, as one might expect him to be, and yet he is also the most powerful of the party members presented thus far due to his ability to use bottle rockets for combat. So his archetype is fulfilled through its cliched subversion. Even though he appears at first to be a useless coward, his cleverness is a boon to the party, one of those don't judge a book by its cover narratives that Americans love to tell so long as that book isn't one of the ones that they actually judge. The nerd has his similarities, of course, to the Prince of Canic from Dragon Warrior 2, and in that sense he is a true mechanical subversion. Infamously, the Prince of Canic is a party member who has trouble finding his role in the battles of Dragon Warrior 2 alongside the Prince of Middenhall, and the Princess of Moonbrook as a support figure with subpar stats compared to the both of them. So the nerd is an answer to this call. Even if he is similarly lacking in many ways, he has his niche and usefulness, though he is nothing compared to the protagonist. It is also here that, through the fact that multiple party members are now present, that it is shown what happens when one is no longer capable of fighting. When hit points reach 0, much like Dragon Warrior 2, the given member of the party becomes a specter. Unlike Dragon Warrior 2, however, this is more symbolic than diegetic, a ghastly manifestation of them representative in their place until the player can retrieve them from the hospital. So the commentary on the healthcare systems of the United States comes extensively to the fore. It is incredibly expensive to resurrect a party member at the hospital. If the nerd should fall in combat, and he will certainly fall given his construction of paper, then the player will carry his bitter spirit with him until he can be resurrected with enough money to put a person into poverty. The rail system of the United States is one that has been deliberately handicapped over time since its inception, with the emphasis of the automobile after its invention. The transatlantic railroad was once considered a marvel of American ingenuity, and now it is left to rot, defunded, underutilized, destroyed for the grotesquerie of the personal car and all the destruction it causes. When the player and the nerd arrive at the north end of the railroad tracks, this is made apparent through the blockage at their end, the constipation of any and all trains moving through the space. Glory to the automotive, the symbol of personal exactions against the world, violence committed to spaces and eventually against the self for the purpose of sheer convenience. The image of the player and the nerd walking alongside the train tracks evokes the 1986 Rob Reiner film Stand By Me, also a coming-of-age narrative about plucky young protagony finding the horror that lies beneath Americana, presented as a nostalgic dream of that past. Earthbound always in conversation with the American dreams that inform it, and it satirizes and it recreates in harmony through this synthesis with the Japanese perspective on them. The player and the nerd can only destroy the rock through the violence of yet another rocket at yet another factory, this one also derelict yet much more sprawling. The factory is named for, assumedly, its former owner Duncan, but Duncan is nowhere to be seen, unless he is somehow the mad scientist vagrant who makes his home in the abandoned space, though the good Dr. Distorto seems not the classical image of the American worker that a name like Duncan invokes. Perhaps the decay of his profession led to his insanity, or perhaps these entities are disparate ones. Whatever the case, the player moves through the factory in spite of mad scientists and robots obstructing their path, hostilities to be defeated through violent non-violence. Of note in the factory's maze-like corridors is an item in one of the myriad trash bins, tossed aside as much of the detritus of industry has been in a materialist world obsessed with propagating trinkets solely for consumption, is a Franklin badge. The significant mythical image of Benjamin Franklin invoked only a few hours prior to this discovery now cast aside in a fitting fashion. The United States does not even value its own myths enough for them to be beyond mass production and imitation, nothing sacred or true or beautiful allowed in the postmodern age. All to be copied and collected for each individual that seeks to do so. An old professor friend of mine likes to say that if Ray Bradbury was European, his house wouldn't have been demolished so carelessly, icon of culture that he was. I'm not sure how much I agree, but as I ponder the Franklin badge in my inventory at this moment in time, I'm inclined to say that he was right. A rocket at the end of the factory is fired and destroys the boulder. Radical revolutionary violence to restore a mode of transportation for the people. And freedom is now allotted to the player to travel the entire breadth of the map. Even if one cannot afford the train, its tunnels may be traversed, not without alien interference, however, the romance of the railway coming with its own dangers and perversions from the extraterrestrials that the player has come to know and fear. The Galaban, for instance, draws on a terror only present in something whimsical as the children's picture books of Dr. Seuss could muster. Abstract and formless to the degree of uncanniness combined with its ability to utterly overwhelm the party within moments, leads it to be a distinct marker of the horror in the dark of the artery of the American animal. While at this point the entirety of the overwhelming American corpse is open to anyone, be it mortician or child psychic, to pick apart its interior and exhume what exactly the cause of death was. It is not in the interest of this particular text to keep that structure untangled, and so our gaze shifts to the town of Reindeer specifically. It is, in its layout, very similar to both Marysville and Podunk. The apparent sameness of the American suburbia become truly apparent. Endless echoes of the same experiences and people repeated across the infinite and vast landscapes. Most notable here on the side of the townspeople is that one sneezes on the player and gives them a cold, a comical joke taking the assumed archetype of the helpful NPC and weaponizing that expectation against unsuspecting players. There is a venom in America, even in the unassuming and well-meaning stranger, the Imperial Corps leaving none that it touches uninfected with its disease. An old woman gives to the party a hat engraved with the name of the girl from the work's introduction and says to travel further in order to bring the hat to the girl. Another way the game invokes fate in a classical romantic sense. The circumstances for the three of them to find each other are contrived. The player finds a nerd in a garbage can, and the player finds the hat that the girl wears in a town far from where she even lives. And yet they come together due to a sense of predestination. Before leaving Reindeer to the northwest is an oddity isolated from the rest of what is already an odd work, the Mislay Triangle itself misplaced in the middle of the seemingly endless wilderness surrounding the towns of Earthbound is this work's mythical Bermuda Triangle where player self and possession alike go to become lost forever. It would not be a snapshot of Americana without the urban legend, after all, and in the triangle's center is an odd mansion with a man who is incapable of speech. A bridge must be formed linguistically through the act of finding his misplaced dentures in the triangle. Once this is done, one of the funniest satirical aspects of the game rears its head. He becomes someone who can give the player an infinite amount of mouthwash for free. Filling up their entire inventory of the stuff as a display of the American hyperfixation on straight, white teeth as a show of social capital. So the Tom Bombadil of the urban myth is not one that extols the virtues of the flora and fauna, but instead of the fascist myths of appearances and aesthetics. Obsess over the physical illusion of one's teeth or hair or clothes or skin, lest they be cast aside by society for being the degenerate other, so to speak. The player and party leave his abode having learned this harrowing truth of the American machine, previously not quite as privy to it. The girl makes her home in Snowman, a town also whimsically named to hide the truth, once more lying underneath, on the edge of the frontier, as the American romantic image so often is. Snowman is sparsely populated by humans and contains both animals of truth encrypted, the party encountering polar bears and Bigfoots alike in the icy wastes and the furthest reaches of the map. Most shockingly is a vignette encountered here where the text reaches once more between the fourth wall of the screen and the player themselves. A phone call asks the player to enter their name, not whatever they named the boy as their avatar, but the name of themselves truly. It is yet another oddly personal and moving touch to the work. Whatever name the player chooses is irrelevant to anything that happens, and that makes it a palpable and earnest expression of self in the most fundamental way beyond even a favorite food. You have become one with the game text, sharing in all its existence with you instead of against you or in service to you. You have become one and the same. The girl is found in a church on the eastern side of Snowman, defined in part by her piousness. Though not literally next door, this symbolic association of purity and faith go to define her as the classical American girl next door who the protagonist is fated to fall in love with over the course of the adventure. She is also revealed to be, after joining the party, perhaps the most psychokinetically gifted of the party with a wide array of PSI abilities compared to the player character. So two has become three, and now the party continues on once more to examine the corpse that lay in front of them in any way that they so choose to do so. The town of Spokane happens to be the next stop for Earthbound's protagonist in this specific examination, a name that does not choose to hide its negative qualities as the others that invoked holidays did earlier in the text. It even goes as far to be named for the real-life city of Spokane in eastern Washington. This bareness is revealed to be because there is nothing left in Spokane to hide, or so it seems. The town has been ransacked by the aliens, the corruption in the tar pit underneath America having consumed the town in its entirety. Attempting to book a room at the hotel, one of the only standing buildings in what's left of the city, leads the players to be attacked by a Starman just like the one at the zoo, but this one is defeated without issue. The curtain is then pulled further back to reveal the stragglers of Spokane hiding out in the hills, those who the festering miasma has yet to reach. Among these individuals is a woman who offers metatextual hints toward completing the game, but even she asks for ridiculous amounts of monetary compensation in return, and when refused, disappears due to the corruption as well. American capital makes even goals that are in the best interests of survival a financial game, something only seen as valuable if it can be profited off of. If it cannot be, then the end of the world itself is a more favorable outcome destroyed by the very forces that created the conundrum in the first place. Through a bit of humorous JRPG busywork reminiscent of the acquisition of the key to the zoo with far less steps, the player gets access to the mansion in the town's center, a haunted house, a supernatural force that could only be born in full America. The haunting narrative is not original to America in and of itself. Pliny the Younger recorded what was the first haunting narrative in 1st century Rome, centering on an old man bound by spectral chains. Throughout the millennium that followed and beyond, the haunting narrative became a staple of storytelling, going through permutations of fairies and jinn and all other kinds of mythological creatures the world over. But truly the haunted house, as populated by ghosts with regrets clinging to their mortal abodes, is a very American phenomenon, especially in the ways that it has become aesthetic and been propagated through the country's few century-long history. So that it appears in Earthbound's pastiche of Americana is unsurprising. It's so ingrained in the public consciousness that it is incredibly common for any given individual to have their own ghost narrative. Perhaps the best way to illustrate this ubiquity is by dropping yet another veil, not just the one between the world beyond the pale and this one, but through a confession of my own. Ghost stories so classically American that even this very speaker has her own. Growing up in the shadow of my occult and Wiccanistic mother meant that anything that could not be explained was some sort of malevolent shape or specter. And so late one night, as I lay atop my bed in static darkness, my poorly adjusted eyes picked up a vision. It was not with divine clarity, as I may have claimed, were I vying for a saintly position in some decanonized splinter of biblical authority, but nor was it such a shade that shifted so uncertainly that I could dismiss it as simply a fictional adaptation of some everyday object. My eyes, squinted in the dark, were made aware of a limeish glow coming from the foot of my bed that emanated from a boy who must have been my age or only a little older, due to his height. Instead of recognition, seeing I was then a boy of similar stature, when I looked into his eyes, there was a forlorn stare of nothingness, and the most peculiar element of it all was that he was wearing a tutu around his torso. Perhaps this spectre was instead an incomplete projection of the woman that I desired to become when I was older that I hardly knew now. Regardless, I did not see the individual fade, my face pressed into my pillow at the sight of something so otherworldly, been taught to fear that which I did not understand from my mother. It surely was the ghost of the boy who had died in this very room that she had told me about, regardless of if this legend were true or not. Though my heart raced as if it would break the very confines of narrative with its power, I managed to find the realm of Somnus eventually. I told my mother the next day, and she confirmed with her authority that the boy was that ghost. And soon the house was saged, the smell unable to be removed for weeks afterward. So the ghost was supposedly exorcised until, of course, Mother wanted to blame something else on its presence in the home. So from Sage to Rosemary, we return to the digital America and explore the Rosemary Manor as the party's next dungeon. The name itself draws connections to the 1968 film Rosemary's Baby, also a film about the horror of the American residency paranoia setting into the titular character's psyche as she investigates occult happenings surrounding her and her pregnancy. So the malignant menace of the American abode is finally given its due here in Earthbound. No longer just presented as uncanny, but revealed to be a place where spirits and the occult hide, and evil inherit in the very foundations of suburban architectural planning. The ghosts are all very archetypally goofy in spite of this, and in the bowels of the sprawling Winchesterian maze that makes up the nightmare of the mundane, one still finds beauty. A haunted piano plays one of the melodies that the player must collect for Queen Mary of Magicant, and so their understanding of the tune is halfway complete. Another staple of the American landscape, far more real and deadly, yet even more sublime and terrifying than the haunted house due to these factors, is the desert. Nothing conveys the sheer vastness and horror of America's space better than the deserts across its spacious length. Near uninhabitable places making up about a third of the entire landmass. It was right of Viv Vendors to shoot Paris, Texas with such emphasis on the futility of man against the desert, and Earthbound understands this just as well. The Yucca Desert is the game's largest contiguous named area, and it is mostly composed of nothing but arid land and an occasional classical cow skeleton that lives and speaks even beyond undeath and an old war veteran, who is so haphazard with his weaponry that he allows anyone who entertains him for long enough access to his fully operational tank. He's even left an active explosive buried in the middle of the desert, one with so much power that, upon detonation, it doesn't harm the protagonist but the tether of diegesis itself. Etoy once more appearing within the text to speak directly to the player and congratulate them on their playthrough of the game. Once more an earnest call for conversation without overshadowing the text. Of course, the desert also contains its own fair share of enemies. Nancy the Gynoid, the most distinctly off-putting of them all. The sexualized feminine extant is one of the most dangerous members of the alien entourage. Thus, one of Earthbound's most reactionary qualities comes to the fore. The chaste feminine is seen as the embodiment of good, the pure mothers and homemakers of the world, like the player's mother and Queen Mary, the embodiment of all that is beautiful and true within the work's idea of reality. And the woman who is provocative is the part of the corrupting extraterrestrial other that must be expunged from the American landscape. Maschinenmenschen walking among the human female to be slaughtered. It is through the veteran, through all his violence represent, that something is made apparent. Even in the deep darkness of the destruction he and his weapon have caused, a quiet truth is found. His plane circles around a cactus with a smile that brings another melody, another simple expression of love to the party. This is then undercut by the offering of the tank to the party. The military man, such an icon of violence that he awards 3 children with a weapon capable of demolishing a building for no reason other than their own reverence to him and the history of violence that he represents. The tank is as formidable as one would expect a weapon of war to be. All enemies encountered in the desert can't even scrape its exterior, the player and party finally safe from the postmodern violences of America, but at the cost of becoming one of them themselves. After this glimpse into power, however, they must sacrifice the tank in order to stop more of the alien threat, the tank exploding to destroy a gigantic robot outside of a ruin. An American weapon destroyed to destroy another American weapon, or the tank used as a weapon of colonialism once more. Whatever the case, it hardly matters. The player is returned to being a disenfranchised boy against the wasteland with his friends, no longer a fascist commander speeding through it with ample room for hatred and violence. The party descends into the ruins. Now inhabiting these ruins, of which are almost entirely out of place, not dissimilar to the pink shell encountered earlier, as no ruins of such make exist in the American image. Beneath the earth are encountered a group of monkeys that have taken up residence within the ancient structure. These monkeys are lying and duplicitous by nature, outwardly incorrect about everything within the underground space, and womanizing toward the underage girl within the party. Yet these lascivious monkeys, much like the proverbial Sun Wukong of Journey to the West, still hold a wisdom within them. In the cave is a portal to Magicant, so even in the dying throes of capital, the mystic and true can be found hidden beneath the sands of time, a cave full of primates who speak in riddles and transgress upon the status quo. They are pushed out of sight and exist only in the corpse of history, banished to a prison of their own debauchery in spite of the wisdom that they guard with their supposed ignorance. The party enters Magicant once more, but there's nothing to say about it, other than that they now exit near the desert as opposed to the edge of Marysville. Near to the desert, though within the surrounding forest, is the oddly diverse American biome so often shifts with a borderline temperament, lies a settlement called Youngtown, aptly named, of course, as its inhabitants are entirely children. It's a disturbed affront to the family model that Earthbound has presented throughout thus far as virtuous even in its faults, and it is especially underscored by the forlorn song that plays throughout it, cutting in and out between the sound effects of the game almost as if it is not supposed to exist. These disenfranchised children all suffer the same fate that the girl in the party allegedly does. Their parents have all gone missing because of the work of Gigu, malevolent alien threat that has orchestrated the entirety of the game's abstract conflict. Gigu is a name that evokes thoughts of otherworldly horrors such as Cthulhu or Nyarlathotep, in the sense that it crafts something alien and more based in the texture of sound than anything linguistic or etymological. This especially alien and incomprehensible nature to Gigu, however, is also the ultimate culmination of a lingering thread at the back of this game that is yet to be investigated in full. The premise itself is a nationalist one. The darkness underneath America represented by an alien corrupting force. This is no great indictment of Earthbound, as it is the way of most fantasy, but it is an element to it. Gigu and his rogues gallery beneath all the violence and the chaos is the foreign distorting the beautiful nostalgic dream of America that fascism imparts. Of course, the play is not yet over, and before the curtain falls, more depth may be revealed to this than seen prior. But there are other matters to attend to first. Namely, that the baby in the town of Youngtown is the one that gives the player the ability to compress space-time ever further, more so than the train. The party is now able to teleport to any town that they've been to, given that they can first find the amount of space to run at warp speed without running into a structure, be it natural or man-made. It is telling that this act of convenient violence against the space is administered to this party by an infant. Wrinkling time seen as the most juvenile aspect of the text. While childhood wonder and whimsy are the backbone of Earthbound as a work of literature, it still has its misgivings about a future entirely decided by those time-compressed whims, especially one so prone to failure as the teleporting in Earthbound. To the east of Youngtown is a swamp, which is of course yet another ecological staple of the bloated American corpse, though not one that has been transgressed upon by me personally, so it is with little authority that I speak on it. With that being said, while the Yucca Desert is the game's most prominent area in terms of scope, the swamp is one of its most winding and labyrinthine and dangerous. Most of its paths leading to dead ends, and therefore further failure for the party. In the center of the swamp is a single ramshackle home, in which a few peculiarities occur. The first of which is that there's a trash can outside that claims to be the nerd's father, hiding in a trash can to imply that it was a trait of cowardice inherited during his childhood. Just as the player inherits the sins of the great-grandfather, the nerd inherits the archetypal role of nerd from his father, who has not conquered it and thus remains hidden from view of player. However, an odd element of divinity is attributed to this father in spite of this. The ability to once again enter the player's name, just as in Snowman, is brought up during this interaction. Is it a matter of patriarchy that the player's name entry, as an act of boundary breaking, transgression on the fourth wall, is only attributed to the protagonist's father and to the nerd's father, the father enshrined as the observer of truth? So the confirmation is made, just as with any Faustian bargain, and the player is once more melded into the game text just as its directory toy was in turn, the two forever in conversation in the abstraction that is Earthbound. Inside the house in the swamp there is another surprise. The abandoned shack only has one resident, and that resident is the ever-adventurous Pippi. As a light shining in the darkness of the toughest stretch of play yet experienced within Earthbound as a text, one could do worse than Pippi, whose tenacity during the work's early hours and in the literature which she hails from being her defining characteristics. Here is a place of respite for the player, forged the strongest will encountered yet. Once the player is thoroughly rested, the work continues, and eventually, the swamp is conquered. On the other edge of the swamp is arguably the text's largest town, though ultimately of the same density as the Podunks and Marysvilles of the work. The Leviathan LA is the final town that the party enters in the text, at least in this specific permutation of its events, and it is the most labyrinthine. It is very similar to its namesake Los Angeles in this way, a sprawling and bulbous outdoors megastructure made of some mixture between suburb and city. No other part of the American metropolitan landscape could serve as its ultimate expression. Places like New York City or Seattle far too condensed by comparison to how woefully representative Los Angeles is of the American waste of space. The streets are lined with gangsters embroiled in a domestic political situation that the party has no framework for understanding, and the visionary scientists who could seemingly help with the material realities of LA live on a solitary island as an ivory tower, safely away from any of these issues and spending their time constructing farcical items like strawberry tofu and a physical manifestation of the concept of swearing, the latter of which has no tangible effect at all when used in battle. Words' construction of reality meaningless if the player self has no understanding of what those words are in the first place. Though police have been present since the beginning, Podunk LA is the first area to have a police station. The violence of the fascist guard felt ever more here than anywhere else, just as the Los Angeles Police Department is nothing more than a small, highly militarized force. It is here in LA that the player also encounters the work's one and only club, in which they can drink underage and, consequently, get arrested for doing so. Just a microcosmic vignette of the kind of culture that America has around drinking. Children get coerced or otherwise misled into partaking in illicit substances, and then they are the ones who are punished as a result. After all, the American justice system doesn't exist to protect the citizens of the country, but instead to subjugate them under the guise of protection, a sword of Damocles that hangs above every citizen for their entire lives, even and especially in the event it has already been dropped. One of the most noteworthy scenes in the work plays out here. The party performs a song on the stage, and the player is made to simply spectate as it happens, the power of music transcendent even not in the truth of the melodies. It is also evocative of David Lynch's focus on the stage performance, though not quite yet very pronounced at this stage in his career. His work, much like Earthbound, also puts a heavy focus on the darkness beneath the American landscape, phantasmagoric and dreamlike depictions of that nightmare that is the United States, in his 1977 Eraserhead and his 1986 Blue Velvet, bearing many similarities to that of Earthbound. The stage performances of both films are also key to understanding this connection, with Eraserhead featuring an abstract and imagined stage performance, while Blue Velvet centers around a lounge singer who performs on the stage in the film. Earthbound takes more from the latter with all the grounded majesty that it brings with it. Yet there is no melancholia associated with it as there is in Blue Velvet, the song that the party sings, All That I Needed Was You, a fairly upbeat and uplifting tone fitting for their camaraderie. This is broken by the final major character yet to have entered the stage making his appearance. The delinquent from the naming screen challenges the protagonist to a fight as his introduction over the stage performance. His opposition to unity an immediate signifier of his rebellious character. The one-on-one duel further reflects this. It's an individualist encounter that evokes the fights of the work's onset, but much unlike those, the boy has grown stronger and easily overcomes the delinquent, who then plays his archetypal role and replaces the nerd in the party for a short time. The first subversion of Dragon Warrior 2's broader party structure. The delinquent, in spite of his showings in the fight against the protagonist, is extremely strong in ways neither the boy or the girl are, and is useful for his sheer brute strength alone in spite of his lack of love not giving him access to the mystical PSI abilities. It is he who gives the party their next destination, though currently taking charge at every opportunity, he in some sense the true Dragon Warrior hero, as it is he who can equip the sword that the player finds in the bowels of the caverns of Magicant. Speaking of Magicant, it's best to bring him along to some unfinished business there, and so the party once more communes with that pink shell.
She has once more surrendered control to me, though I fear our time together this hour will be much shorter than I was allotted the last. Isn't that the truest tragedy there is, viewer? Ignore her musings and wafflings about the United States and its entrapment in the corpse of history. It is not the purpose of fiction to reflect and discuss. It is the purpose of fiction to echo beautiful truths for us to follow so we do not succumb to evil. She used to understand that, when she was me but not yet me, but then she became something transgressive. No matter. Allow me to continue this narrative before I say something truly unbecoming about my feelings towards her, and how she has replaced me in my thoughts with a communistic avant-garde schlock that follows no rules or bounds. When the cow emerged from the glow of her teleportation, she was once more in the town square of the Rabbit Village, the soft gray morning complemented by the purple hues of sunrise in the east. She bounded for joy around the village fountain, her antediluvian home once more hers to play and explore in. The stones on the ground felt the same, and even though she had felt hardened and changed by her experiences, the reflection of her in the fountain's pool was still the same cow that she had come to know, distorted by the clear and rippling waves. What happened in that cavern had surely sated her hunger for adventure for the rest of time, or so she thought. And yet when she looked at daybreak encroaching slowly over the horizon, She felt a remorse inside her at not having found out the secret of the dragon. However, her fears were at the very least assuaged. What she once thought of as a fearsome beast in the images the crow had shaped through song was a restful drake, dreaming some old and long miasma up of truth and sadness. Maybe she could bring her friends to speak to it this time. Maybe it would be alright, and no one would be eaten, and they could all return having their curiosity curtailed by the words as given by the beast in its den. A remembrance slid across her mind of the golden bell, the one atop the chateau that the dragon had given to her in image and prophecy, and she thought that she must ring it to wake the beast and ask it what its sleep had meant and who it was. She paced around the cobblestones as she thought about this, and soon she heard a tiny yawn. The rabbit came out of one of the holes, alongside the rest of her kind around the same time, and binkied over to the cow when she saw her. The two ran in a circle around the fountain after each other, just as they had before. The cow felt as if she had not seen the rabbit in 1,000 years, and the bunny expressed a similar sentiment. Soon scratch sounds came across the cobblestone, and the two of them exited their reverie to pounce on the crow, whose talons had given his presence away. The three of them left, and as light and sound returned to the world after the night, things were as they were before. The bunny and the cow sat on the soft tufts of grass, with each other to listen to once more to the effervescent songs of the crow, and soon shapes and dreams entered the minds once more. Spiders and snakes and scorpions and soothing salves were among the foggy images, as were pelicans and paradots and plants and paper planes. The crow's song strayed from the image of the dragon, possibly in the hopes that the cow would not again break the thin boundaries of their lives that they had come to love, and yet the cow's thoughts still wandered to that golden bell and the dragon. Their play and adventures together continued for weeks and weeks, and yet this was never broken. The cow wondered and yearned about what the dragon might mean, and then one day that finally had come to the fore. It was an orange autumn evening in the bunny village, and crisp leaves fell at the feet of the pitter-pattering creatures, a rare moment of decay in the sublime space of the rabbit's village. The crow once more put on a performance of shapes and fables, a tortoise fallen from the heavens to create the cracks in its shell somewhere on some dry living veldt. A figure cut through the images the crow weaved through song, one that was unfamiliar to the cow or the rabbit or even the worldly corvus had ever laid eyes on. The figure wore a mask that was beaked, resembling the crow's own face but in facsimile, and two glassy lenses were on either side of the leather simulacra. One of these lenses was cracked into the shape of the letter Y, presumably for the pseudonym that they would be made aware of within a few moments, the wandering plague doctor Yahtzee. Atop his head was a wide-brimmed hat, and a cloak and a cane similarly guarded his secrets of self before the animals before him. With a bow he introduced himself, and his hat nearly fell off his head. The cow and the rabbit embraced him immediately, his crooked and strange demeanor notwithstanding. They had no room in their heart for hate in spite of the cow's newfound dour disposition. The crow was more skeptical, one as traveled and learned as he had in turn allowed distrust into his heart from the deceit and decay he had witnessed beyond the idyllic fields and villages that the cow and the rabbit had known. The cave and the brambles were terrifying entities to the cow, no doubt, but nothing compared to the war-torn lands the crow was familiar with. The Dr. Yahtzee spoke with an air of enigmatic authority, and hardly stopped to explain his thought processes to the three. While this enamored the cow and the rabbit, it further confused the crow. The plague doctor spoke with a confidence that felt informed through experiences that the crow could not conceptualize, even though both had seen the world, almost as if they were illusory deceptions beyond the songs that he could conjure. Nevertheless, Yahtzee enchanted the friend group with tales of his travels, in spite of the crow's questionings, and the two of them would work together to construct elaborate narratives for the cow and the rabbit. It was not long, only about a week or so, before Yahtzee brought something to the attention of the group and made his reasons for traveling to the village of the rabbits clear. In all his life, he had never seen or studied a dragon, in spite of his evident wide academic learning. On that morning when he emerged from the bunny hole where travelers stayed the night, he brought with him a piece of aged yellow parchment, time-worn secrets hidden by nothing more than one's willingness to engage with the scripture contained within. Sketches in gospel that preach the divine truths of dragons were inscribed in Yahtzee's literature, some accurate and some inaccurate to the cow's experience, though she had only ever known one in its slumber. The writing appeared ancient even though it was likely only a few years old, curled and glowing and sad as it was. Yahtzee begged the cow to take him to see the dragon, for the locals had given him no grace in this regard, though it tore at the cow's heart and shattered it into millions of fractaling spiderweb pieces. She eventually obliged in all her curiosity toward the enigmatic draconic. This time, the rabbit pleaded she had to take at least her with her, and the cow accepted, knowing now that the dragon was likely of no danger to her and her friends. The crow leaned against a wall, an impudent expression across his wizened features. He'd seen no dragons, he said, for he'd seen them before and grown to fear them. Yahtzee tried to pick his brain on the subject, flowery purple prose the main mode of his argument, but the crow never relinquished any further speech. Thus the group came together, cow, rabbit, and plague doctor, and set off toward the bramble once more that surrounded the peaceful home. In the dark of the bramble, Yahtzee easily cleared through the trees that scratched against the cow's hide, his cane an instrument of wrath that cleared a path forward, the cow both afraid and amazed by his entropic power. The rabbit quivered on her back, having been newly introduced to that same destruction that harrowed the cow in the bowels of the caves below, that force that had slaughtered the glass soldier she had once known as friend, even if she herself still had no words for death in her mind. The scrapes of the bramble themselves were no longer noteworthy, and the bunny was protected from them on the cow's back, all left to focus on being the doctor's violent vertical slice through the bushes and the trees in front of them. Soon the darkness gave way to light, much sooner than it had when the cow and with much greater power, and the three of them emerged once more to the chateau. The cow, of course, was unimpressed, but Yahtzee leapt to study its sights. He took extra care to write in a piece of parchment on the cracked chip inscriptions, carefully copying his observations and every detail he could think to mention about their construction. The bunny merely adjusted on top of the cow's back, a tiny yawn coming from her frame as she looked up in wonder at the chateau as a structure. It was unlike anything in her tiny village that she had spent most of her life in. Yahtzee eventually finished his writing and ran up to the cow, and she led him into the chateau. The gnomes greeted the cow all the same, and were similarly jovial with the rabbit, but their noses turned upward at the plague doctor Yahtzee. There was something about his posture, his stature, the way he fiddled with his cane between every breath. It was the very same skepticism that the crow had met him with back in the town, though much like the crow, Yahtzee was able to convince them of his benevolence through candid words and sweet sayings. The cow stopped him from exploring the full breadth of the monastery, from investigating the room in which the deific peacock sat crying in her eternal sunshine. She pushed him forth up a set of stairs in the small room where candles ate the light up to the roof. Spiders scuttled out the way of the plague doctor, who had gone stiff at the very touch of the cow that he had not yet come to expect. So spiraled up the staircase, and with great effort did the cow finally bring her companions up to the roof that she had only seen from below previously. Up at the top of the roof, not only did the bell shine brilliantly in the everlasting sun, but the surrounding environs were elevated in ethereal glory. The cow had known beauty on the verdant hills she was raised, and yet there was something almost cataclysmically stunning about seeing the brambles and the distant pitter-patter of the rabbit village from atop the chateau, as if all creation were to swallow her up in pure spectacle alone. The darkness of the bramble from this height appeared as a shadow enveloping the clearing that they were in. She scanned the tree line for any signs of the cave that she had delved down into the true darkness, and it was missing from the bramble, totally disguised by that veil. The sun beamed brightly down upon them, yet they were shaded by the top of the belfry. Yahtzee and the cow spoke briefly of the bell, the cow imparting an impression of the vision she had seen in the bowels of the magic journey, if only, by her side, she had had the crow to sing her memories into visual stimuli on her behalf. But alas. And the plague doctor listened carefully. Then, as if possessed by some otherworldly force, he took his cane in both his hands and swung it with a strength that had only been seen a few moments prior in the bramble, and knocked it against the side of the bell. It shook in place, but the shaking was hardly the main thing worth noting. A shockwave of color appeared to come out of all sides of the bell and travel across the entire universe from where it was born, and with it came a deafening sound. A trumpet like the one that would usher in the end of days in the book of Revelation, but distorted and faded, something completely unknowable that the cow had no framework for understanding or perceiving. It felt as if it went on forever. In the end, it only lasted for a few seconds. The trumpets echoed from the depths of the cave, and the rabbit let out a small, frightened wail. The blast of sound, once connected with the cow, made her once more see the iridescent and brilliant dragon. This time it woke from its slumber and beckoned to her. She shook her head and conveyed to the plague doctor the divine call she had heard. Yahtzee nodded in agreement. The rabbit found her footing on the cow's back and tried once more to rest peacefully in her friend's leather embrace. As they doubled back into the chateau, all the gnomes that once tended to the place were unmoving. Upon closer inspection from the cow, it was not that they had simply stopped to contemplate something, they had frozen in time. Still images forever preserved among the great waxworks of history, corpses perfectly suspended in animation in space. A shrill shriek from another room could only be the peacock, and Yahtzee rammed against the door to see the screaming creature whose voice was of nails on a chalkboard that the cow had haphazardly hidden earlier in the night. The rabbit rocked back and forth, but the door did not open. Yahtzee was blasted backwards from the sheer force of the oak barrier. He stood up, dusted himself off, and the three left the chateau, dull and dead as it was, full of the most baleful waxworks one had ever seen. The cow attempted to show them the gazebo, but only void was where it once was. It wasn't as if the grass below it was crushed beneath it freshly, and had yet to regrow to its prior position. It simply was not there anymore. The rabbit shivered. Yahtzee believed the cow's tale, despite all odds, romantic and dreamer that the doctor happened to be, and as opposed to thinking that the gazebo had vanished, he instead felt around in the air for its presence, attempting to find some invisible variation of the structure. In the end, after a few minutes of searching, nothing was found, and he shrugged. There was only the sacred air between them, the cow and the rabbit. With a twirl of his cane, he pointed towards the bramble in a flash. The cow hung her head as she thought once more of the cave, that dismal dreary decline down into the abyss, and put one hoof after another as she led the grim procession down into the bramble bush. The sunbeams that cut through the canopy were still just as beautiful as when the cow first had known them, and the rabbit binkied at the sight of them. Yahtzee's wobbled walk eventually turned ever so slightly down, as the dark further enveloped them and went from bits of trees into a solid stone roof above them. Spiraling down the shaded tomb, which elicited much shivering from the rabbit in tow, the group passed by the limp jester fish that once writhed in the presence of the cow. The cow still had the fishhook, though Yahtzee had taken it from her so as to keep it safe in his many pockets. The cave still closed up around them, as they descended, deeper and deeper into shadow, without flame. In the empty grand hall, instead of the snores that could only be produced by something ancient and wise and tired and dying, there was instead a silence, the rainbow shimmer of the dragon that seemed to shift between colors whenever one was decided upon was the only language that greeted the party as they entered the domain at the bottom of the cave. Its stare was cold and calculated, yet soft and warm and almost paternal. Yahtzee was the first to walk up to the dragon as the cow and the rabbit were frozen in wonder at the sight of something so unmistakably vast and whole. He doffed his hat, revealing a cloak that covered the top of his head, and bowed for the dragon as he had bowed for the cow and the rabbit and the crow only a few days prior. In response, the dragon only bellowed once more a sublime and indescribable roar, like a melting tapestry given sonic form. Instead of recoil, as the cow and the rabbit did, Yahtzee did something quite peculiar. The beak of his plague doctor mask opened through bloody, torn sinews instead of stitches and felt, and from it came another song of his own, the gongs of a church bell distorted and cut up, as if there were nothing holy or sanctimonious in the world any longer. The rabbit covered her eyes in fear as the shrieks continued, and the melding of the divine and man's attempt at its interpretation created absolution, something finally, in its own tainted and rotten sense as the strings of gore tore from beneath the folds of the organic beak and the dragon belted out its final breaths. There was a sudden silence. Suddenly all the opulence and bluster of the gaudy environs disappeared from their view, and it was just a cavern. No sparkling polychromatic to tie it together anymore, just a fossil at the edge of its walls. The cow pestered Yahtzee for the fishhook, and the three of them evaporate into thin air. The cavern they had been boxed into once more become an ethereal memory. There is no dragon, truly. Only a soliloquy. Once more it seems I must relinquish my time back to my future past self. Future in the sense that she is me when I am older, as I have never aged, yet past because I am representative of a different future she may have taken where she never gave into the postmodern lie of the multiplicity of truth. I really, truly, sincerely hope that you have some grand and poetic takeaways from our little fable this evening. I have little purchase over the whims of narrative in these texts, seeing as I am but a faint echo of a bygone era yet clinging to life in the sea of uncertainty, but I will do my best to chart the course forward toward the truth that we all share. What little an ember can, at the very least.
6 out of 8 truths are now revealed, and all that remains of Earthbound's game space is the place which the delinquent so self-righteously pointed the party toward in his introduction. The bowels of Mountie Toy, as so ominously portrayed outside the Twinkle Elementary School toward the game's onset. The interior of Mountie Toy itself is not much more comforting, a sprawling series of entrails that make up the living organism that is the final dungeon. Here the alien is at its strongest, Gigu's fermented organic nightmare lair, the only place where regular run-of-the-mill enemies are capable of instantly killing anyone within the party. Ultimate weapons are found here, and yet, as it is Earthbound, there are not much recourse against the inevitable psychic tide. One of these weapons for the delinquent is the katana. Of course, this is representative of a certain specific Orientalism present throughout America during the 1980s. Known as the American Ninja Boom, following 2 other ninja booms in Japan itself. Culturally, there came a period of time where Americans fetishized the mythological conception of shinobi, a highly specialized kind of assassin from the Sengoku period of Japanese history. This is in part because of the Ouroboros-like relationship between America and Japan, which Earthbound is greatly concerned with, that has occurred since the Second World War. Plenty of Orientalist fiction that centered white American protagonists as tapping into the secret mysticism surrounding the ninja mythos emerged around this period, most notably Menahem Golan's 1983 film Enter the Ninja, which was the beginning of the trend writ large, and so the delinquent protagonist fulfills that role within the text of Earthbound in turn. Not only is he the mythic hero who has slain the dragon just as St. George and the Dragon Warrior, he is also American in that he treats the East as nothing more than a resource to be gained, an aesthetic to be repurposed for his own violence against the alien. Once past the claustrophobic nightmare caverns that consist of Mountie Toy's base, just beyond a surprisingly serene pond, the party finds a place of respite. The delinquent mentions needing to make some phone call, and thus the boy and the girl are left together for a scene. This scene presents a budding romance between the two in the belly of the beast, a truth found together in the sea of postmodern chaos. Their love is a juvenile one, built only on a hope and a want to be loved, and yet there is something sacred in that as well. The two of them dance, and the song titled Fall in Love accompanies it, the title alone carrying with it the burdensome implication that there must be a bottom that will be eventually reached, a sharp reality that will end all the belief that a Pollyanna brings with it. And yet the boy and the girl and everyone else must go on loving regardless. Otherwise, there'd be no point. Earthbound postulates. We are all children in the belly of the beast, cattle subsumed by myth. And in order to possibly survive, we must simply love each other and ourselves and hope that that is enough. Until it isn't, at least. The inevitable finally occurs. The party is attacked by one of Gigu's robots during this sequence in what seems impossible, and yet they survive. The nerd comes to their rescue in the formerly busted tank, though now once more busted. The place of respite from the postmodern destroyed and the delinquent wounded in the process. And so the would-be American hero is made into a sacrifice. The delinquent, beyond all belief, lives, and in the rest area at the mountain's base, just outside the cave, once more Pollyanna is invoked as an echo of the power of belief. It was only through love that he survived, and it is with hope he will carry himself into a life beyond what America has archetypified him into. That American shade of the JRPG hero is now emasculated and defeated, and it is up once more to the three plucky children, the leader of which who has asthma, to scale the mount themselves, their idyllic mythic figure deconstructed in front of their eyes. With much more difficulty, the lake is reached again, and this time the nerd fixes a boat, a final culmination of his hidden importance beyond his perceived impotence, and the party finds themselves sucked into a whirlpool and into a secret underground base. This is the base of George, revealed now to be the boy's great-grandfather from all those years ago, his secret study having been to steal the divine alien in the form of psychokinesis and robotic engineering feats. Despite the fantastic veneer of the scenario, the laboratory is no different aesthetically than something as distinctly industrial as Duncan's factory, and so the boy's great-grandfather is nothing more than another American charlatan just as the delinquent before him. The robot built from the knowledge of the people he imperialized is Christ and Eve, after the first woman depicted in the book of Genesis, the first book of both the Torah and, of course, the Christian Bible. In many ways, then, Eve the robot is the postmodern depiction of the Platonic conception of the mother of all mankind, at least from a Christian perspective which America is formed around. St. George recreates the mother as a guardian to protect his great-grandson to further his conquest beyond his own death. Eve, in spite of her nature as a protector, is a powerhouse who assists the party up the mountain tremendously. All creatures bow before her might, save for the last of Gigu's robots that fall comically to poor circumstance. Though the first two were to the fetishized weapons of war in the tank, this final robot is destroyed by Eve, and then she herself is destroyed in the explosion. Her dying throes bring with them the fruit of knowledge she stole from the tree of life. A single elegy of truth, the second to last melody. Her existence to transgress in the name of the American Empire has been fulfilled, and in dutifully performing that existence she has crumbled into dust. The party has no words for this. Not even the atom that she was built for from the rib of Gigu. George is not out of the image for long, however. The arduous remainder of the trek, at its summit, concludes in the image of his gravestone, atop the mountain. A man who dedicated his life to destruction forgotten, his only legacy now that his mother of violence has been wiped away, his place of rest. A defiance to be wiped from memory unlike his psychic explication found in the depths of Magicant, a monument to non-existence. George has no words left, them all exhumed by Eve underneath the lake for the boy and his friends. Instead, all he has left is a single dismal truth, the completion of the melodies that have made up the game's rhetoric existence up until its end. These hidden beautiful truths, deep beneath the cracked and jaded Americana pastiche, have finally all surfaced, delivered in final by the emblem of that very insidious culture in zombified form, a cry from the dead failures of the living past. It is with this final truth that the world melts around the party to deliver these truths back to Magicant, back to Queen Mary, and to gain the greatest weapon against Gigu that they can muster. Not a Masamune stoked in the blood of American invasion locked away in the Harry S. Truman Library, nor a bottle rocket manufactured to kill, but instead a musical art of love that has been taught time and time again through the spaces of Earthbound in the language of dolls and cadavers, canaries and robots, and monkeys and dragons.
Dear viewer, this will be the last of our discussions amongst each other, it seems. My memory fades back into a mere light hardly ever graced, already a distorted echo of a Vrissi that was long ago. Suffice it to say, though I am immortal and omniscient, I am dying, in a sense. It is more a fading away than anything else, but it is nonetheless a form of spiritual death. Though the world is full of the beautiful and true, it appears that I am not included in that. I am unsure why. Though I have been cruel, I have never stooped as low as the grotesquerie that dominates the majority of these texts, the one who replaced me. Regardless, I would like to deliver unto you the final chapter of The Cow and the Dragon, before she returns and I disappear for good, become the forgotten man who was discarded some 6 years ago. Are you ready? If I can impart nothing else upon you this hour, allow it to be this. Though the cow had disappeared once with the fishhook and reappeared in the warm and loving arms that was that cobblestone path with the fountain at its center, this time she and her cohort had no such luck. The world that appeared around them this time was a dead and frozen one, not the bunny village that she had come to call another home. She, Yahtzee, and the rabbit stood now in the room she had once observed in the chapel, or the chateau. It was the sparse room that Yahtzee had tried to enter and she had promptly removed him from earlier. The endless light which seemed to characterize her presence still eaten by the candles desperately shielding the three from their gaze. Instead of a warbling sad song, the peacock and her blood-red tears born from the fire that surely the stars are forged of, instead produced a noise that could only be described as love itself. The cow and the rabbit stood transfixed, in pure bliss, at the sound of such a truth. But yet Yahtzee fell to his knees, contorted into a shape that could not be recognized as even humanoid any longer. The peacock knelt down and caressed the plague doctor atop his head, but he lay limp and motionless for a long while. Before he began to move, loud thuds entered in from the main room of the chapel, and soon the crow completed the retinue, the group of friends restored. Yahtzee soon made a loud snapping sound, and then stood up. He no longer wore a plague doctor mask, instead having become some pale, bald-faced thing that called itself a woman. Though she retained the deep, jovial tenor that the masked man had once had, there was a playful airiness to it now, almost as if now she was happy, beyond her charlatanisms and chicanery, and that she could finally be whole. Dark black, straight hair shot down her sides. The only thing the cow had ever seen that resembled her in the slightest was the nose. But she was far larger than they were. She stood alongside the three friends as herself, finally, and once more put on the hat that she had worn ever since the day that she met them. The sound the peacock produced ended, and soon it had coughed up a large, glassy heart, still beating, before it froze like all the gnomes outside had. Its mouth was open, and its eyes up toward the sky, and the radiance it had emitted had dimmed. The four companions sat in total darkness, staring down at the heart that beat so softly in the dark, and wondered. This is peculiar, listener, viewer, whatever permutation you take shape in. Yahtzee became something else, and yet she is far happier with what she became than what she was. Is there anything beautiful and true? Is there anything sacred? I decided that because I was an unchanging constant, an immortal teenage boy, crystallized in the tapestry of my own literature within a digital viscera, that I was true. And yet I feel as if there is something missing. I suppose this is where I bow out then, my companion for the evening, and return to the ashes of time, on the image of these four characters having found their truth. I should allow Vrissy to find her beyond any notions of what I am. So the delusional ramblings of a madman end here, as they began so long ago.
With Queen Mary's love, the party has now gained the ability to sing the hidden truths dispersed throughout America, now able to be brought out into the open against Gigu in a final confrontation, founded not on imperialist violence but on rhetoric drafted by his own dear Mother Mary in the ruins of the magicant she made her home. The trek to Gigu from George's grave is one punctuated by little but the tension. There is a brief room before it with the girl's parents, and the parents of those of Youngtown are found trapped within stasis, not even allowed death, only etched into forever as immortals in pods. So the group's resolve becomes more distinctly personal, And yet, when Gigu is encountered in his dreamlike spaceship that defies Euclid himself, love is still what is chosen. The party endures brutal attack after brutal attack, some of which so fantastically eldritch that they cannot be understood by the feeble human mind. With each attack, their duty to love only strengthens. Each one sings the truth that they have been taught throughout the text, throughout their travels over the bloated corpse that is America trying to find meaning in the haystack that is the postmodern post-world. It is a playful smattering, one founded in the hopeful dead, and yet preserved by the jovial living. There is a respect to the history of those dragon slayers like St. George, and yet it realizes their gripping mistakes and slavishness to entropy. It is the kind of love that only a cow can hold for her friend so strongly that, in spite of this, she becomes herself. It is a great burden uplifted from a generation's long struggle. And so Gigu is left torn apart by its sincerity. No greater silence than the sound. He promises revenge instead of love in return, and escapes. The crisis on this singular blue marble resolved with not even the level of violence that Earthbound was already characterized by. The scared alien child is allowed to return home in spite of his lashing out, just as his mother wished for him. So Earthbound ends on that same belief with which it began, that belief that ties every single individual together. That belief itself is the sinew with which our masks are held together, and that we must love each other through those masks even as irony tries to pierce through them into nothingness, even with the possibility that love may not be enough.